An officer collapsed during a chase, but his K-9 partner's heroic act left the world stunned. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The city pulsed with energy as sirens blared through the streets, their piercing wail cutting through the warm evening air. Officer Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on the wheel of his squad car, his pulse steady but sharp. Dispatch crackled in his earpiece, feeding him real-time updates. Suspect is on foot. Last seen near Carter and 5th. Armed and dangerous. Officers in pursuit. Hayes barely needed the instructions. His eyes locked onto the blur of movement up ahead. A man in dark clothing weaving through pedestrians, shoving his way past startled bystanders. The fugitive's breath came ragged, his body already slowing from exhaustion. Beside him, Max, his K-9 partner, sat poised and ready. The German shepherd's ears were perked, his muscles coiled like a spring. He could sense it, the hunt, the tension in the air. Hayes slammed the brakes, his adrenaline spiking. Go! The door flung open and Max launched. The shepherd hit the ground at a full sprint, his claws scraping against the pavement as he locked onto the suspect. Hayes was only a step behind, his feet pounding against the asphalt. The chase led them into a narrow alleyway, the fugitive glancing back, panic flashing across his face as he realized how close they were. His pace faltered, his breath ragged. Max surged forward. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp pain stabbed into Hayes' chest. His breath hitched, his vision blurred, his body betrayed him. His knees buckled, the world tilted, the pavement rushed up to meet him. For a moment, everything went silent. Then Max skidded to a halt. The suspect was still running, still escaping. But Max hesitated. His handler was down. Max turned, his sharp brown eyes locking onto Hayes, his ears flicking with confusion. This had never happened before. Hayes had always been right behind him. But now he wasn't. The moment stretched, an impossible decision. Pursue or protect. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Max's instincts took over. He spun on his paws and bolted after the suspect. The fugitive had no idea the shepherd was still coming for him. He was too focused on his escape, on the sound of sirens behind him, on the weight of his own mistakes catching up to him. But Max was faster. In an instant, the shepherd closed the gap. One final stride, then he leaped. His body collided with the suspect's legs, sending the man crashing to the ground. The fugitive yelped, scrambling, but Max was already on him, teeth bared, a deep growl vibrating from his throat. The man froze. Officers flooded the alleyway a second later, weapons drawn, barking commands. Hands where we can see them. But the fugitive wasn't even trying to resist. His face was pale, his breath shaking. His hands shot into the air as Max kept him pinned, his body motionless beneath the weight of the shepherd's stance. It was over, but Max wasn't done. His ears twitched, his nose flared. He turned and bolted back toward Hayes. Max sprinted back toward where Hayes had fallen, his paws barely touching the pavement as his instincts screamed at him to move faster. He had done what he was trained to do. Stopped the suspect, made the streets safe, but now something was wrong. His handler was down, unmoving, and the air smelled different. He skidded to a halt beside Hayes' body, whining as he nudged his partner's arm with his nose. No response. The officer's chest rose and fell unevenly, his breath shallow. Max could hear it, his heartbeat wasn't steady. Panic surged through the dog, but he knew he couldn't just sit and wait. He barked, loud, sharp, desperate. It echoed through the alley, bouncing off the brick walls. Pedestrians nearby turned their heads, a few stepping forward hesitantly. Max barked again, this time lower, more urgent. He didn't care who responded, he just needed someone to help his handler. The first officer rounded the corner at a sprint, his gun still drawn, expecting another fight. Instead, his eyes widened at the sight before him. Officer Hayes collapsed, Max standing over him like a guardian. "Officer down!" The officer's voice was sharp, cutting through the commotion. More officers stormed forward, their focus shifting from the suspect to Hayes. Max didn't move. His stance was protective, his ears flicking between the humans rushing in. A paramedic was called in, and as soon as they arrived, Max felt hands trying to move him away. He growled. A deep, low sound, not of aggression, but of refusal. "This is his K9, one officer muttered. "He won't leave him." A paramedic crouched beside Max, reaching out slowly. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. We're going to help him." Max's tail flicked once, hesitantly, but his eyes never left Hayes. The paramedic carefully placed fingers to Hayes' neck, checking his pulse. Their expression darkened. "He's in cardiac distress," they said, pulling out a radio. "We need to transport now." Max whined as they began moving Hayes onto a stretcher. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt the urgency. The officers exchanged glances as they loaded Hayes into the ambulance. K9s weren't usually allowed inside emergency vehicles, but the way Max was pacing, his entire body tense with anticipation, it wasn't just a partnership. It was family. One of the paramedics hesitated. "If we don't take him, he's going to try to chase us the whole way." A quick decision was made. "Bring him in." Max leaped into the ambulance before anyone could second-guess it, positioning himself at Hayes' side as the doors slammed shut and the sirens blared to life. The ride to the hospital was a blur of frantic medical orders and beeping monitors. But Max didn't need to understand the words to know one thing. His handler was fighting for his life, and he wasn't leaving his side. The ambulance tore through the streets, its sirens wailing as the paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Officer Hayes. Max sat rigid beside his handler, his ears flicking at every unfamiliar sound. His breathing was shallow, mirroring Hayes' labored gasps. The air in the small space felt tight, filled with the sterile sting of antiseptic and something far worse, the smell of distress. Max nudged Hayes' limp arm with his nose, but there was no response. His handler, the man who had always been strong, always in control, was completely still. The paramedics exchanged quick, tense words that Max couldn't understand, but their movements were frantic. One of them pressed something to Hayes' chest. Another reached for a defibrillator. Charging clear, a sharp jolt ran through Hayes' body, his chest rising and falling violently before settling again. The monitor let out a single beep, then another. Still too slow. Max whined. A high-pitched, desperate sound. A paramedic turned toward him, their voice softer. "We're doing everything we can, buddy." But it wasn't enough. Max knew it wasn't enough. His instincts screamed at him to act. He stepped forward, pressing his muzzle into Hayes' cheek, nudging him again, this time more firmly. Nothing. Max let out a short bark, his tail stiff. He wasn't just calling to Hayes. He was demanding him to wake up. The paramedics exchanged glances. One of them hesitated. "Wait, look." Hayes' fingers twitched. Max barked again, his voice sharp and commanding. This wasn't just a random response, it was connection. Another twitch, then a faint, pained groan. Max let out a second, softer whine, his body tensing as he leaned into Hayes. The paramedics froze, watching. Slowly, weakly, Hayes' eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, glassy, but he was there. One of the paramedics let out a relieved breath. "That's it, officer. Stay with us." Max let out a quiet huff, his body pressing closer as if to ground him. The next few minutes were chaos, medical instructions flying back and forth, the rush of equipment being adjusted. But Max only focused on one thing. Hayes was alive. When the ambulance finally skidded to a halt outside the hospital, the back doors flung open, and Hayes was rushed inside. Max tried to follow, but an orderly blocked his path. "He can't come in here," they said, firm but not unkind. "We need space to work." Max's ears flattened. He wouldn't leave. A second later, a familiar voice, weak but unmistakable, rasped from the gurney. "Let him stay." Every head turned toward Hayes. His voice was barely above a whisper, his face pale, but his eyes were locked on Max. "He stays," Hayes murmured, before his head slumped back against the pillow. A long pause, Then, reluctantly, the orderly stepped aside. Max trotted forward, tail flicking anxiously, and followed as the hospital doors swung shut behind them. Max padded alongside the gurney as the hospital staff rushed Hayes through the halls, his nails clicking softly against the sterile tile floor. The scent of antiseptic filled his nose, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of blood and sweat. But none of it mattered. His handler was still breathing. That was all Max cared about. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, voices overlapping as they shouted vitals and medical orders. Hayes was barely conscious, his head rolling slightly as they maneuvered him toward an emergency room. Max kept close, his body tense, his ears twitching at every sound. Then, just as they reached the doors to the trauma unit, a nurse stepped forward, blocking his path. "He can't go any farther," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "We need to work on him now." Max's tail lowered slightly, but his posture remained rigid. He wasn't leaving. Not again. A doctor gave a sharp nod. "Get him to the waiting area. We'll update you when we can." An officer, one Max vaguely recognized from the precinct, stepped forward. "Come on, Max. Let's give them space." Max didn't move. His brown eyes flicked toward the doors that had just closed behind Hayes, his body still as a statue. He belonged in there. This was his partner, his duty. The officer sighed. "I know, buddy, but they're doing everything they can." He reached for Max's harness, but the dog took a quick step back, letting out a low, almost inaudible whine. Another voice joined them. "He stays." Max's ears perked at the familiar rasp. A nurse turned, eyes widening as she saw Hayes, barely awake, head turned toward the doors. His voice was weak, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. "He stays," he repeated, each word forced but clear. The room fell silent for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, the doctor nodded. "Fine," she said, "but he stays out of the way." Max didn't need to be told twice. He moved swiftly to the corner of the room, lying down with his head resting between his paws, his gaze locked on Hayes. The medical team got to work. Max watched, unmoving, as doctors attached monitors, inserted IVs, checked vitals. The machines beeped and hummed, a rhythmic noise that seemed to fill the room with life. Minutes passed, then an hour. Max never looked away. At some point, a nurse approached him cautiously, a small bowl of water in hand. "Here, boy, you should drink." Max barely flicked his ears. He wasn't thirsty. He wasn't hungry. He was waiting. Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness, his body weak but stable. The tension in the room gradually eased. The doctors stepped back, their movements less frantic now. The worst had passed, and yet Max didn't relax. Not until he heard it. A slow, weak whisper. "Max!" The dog's head snapped up. His tail twitched. Hayes' eyes were half open, his gaze searching. Max pushed up onto his paws, stepping forward cautiously. Hayes' fingers twitched at his side, barely lifting, barely moving, but reaching. Max closed the distance in a heartbeat. He pressed his nose into Hayes' palm, warm and steady. A breathy chuckle left Hayes' lips, so faint that only Max could hear it. "Good boy." Max exhaled softly, finally allowing his body to relax, just a little, because he knew his handler was coming back. The hospital room was quiet now, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Max lay curled up at the foot of Hayes' bed, his ears twitching slightly with every sound, but his body finally at ease. The worst was over. His handler was still here. Hayes, though weak, was awake. His breathing was steadier, and the color had started to return to his face. The four dripped slowly beside him, tubes and monitors still attached, but none of that mattered to Max. He could feel it. His partner was going to be okay. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Max's head lifted instantly, his eyes sharp. It was Nick Jensen, another officer from the precinct, carrying a paper bag and a cup of coffee. His expression softened when he saw Max at the foot of the bed. "You're still standing guard, huh?" Hayes gave a weak chuckle. "Wouldn't have it any other way." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but it was there. stronger. Nick stepped inside, placing the coffee on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Hayes shifted slightly, wincing as he moved. "Doc says I had a cardiac event. Stress, dehydration. Pushed too hard." Nick sighed, shaking his head. "You scared the hell out of all of us." Hayes' gaze flickered to Max, who was still watching them closely, his brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Tell me about it," he muttered. Nick exhaled and sat down in the chair beside the bed. "You know you're all over the news, right?" Hayes frowned. "What?" Nick pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before turning the screen toward him. The video played. Max sprinting through the alley, leaping onto the suspect. Officers shouting. The takedown. Then the part that made Hayes' chest tighten. Max running back to him, barking, calling for help. The video had over 1 million views. "Jesus," Hayes muttered. Nick smirked. "That's not even the best part." He swiped to another screen, headlines. "Hero K9 saves partner. Takes down fugitive in daring chase. Loyal K9 refuses to leave officer's side after medical emergency. Max, the bravest dog on the force. The story that's bringing the nation to tears." Hayes shook his head, glancing down at Max. "You're famous, buddy." Max thumped his tail once but remained where he was, completely unimpressed by the attention. His job was never about recognition. It was about loyalty. Nick grinned. "The mayor called. He wants to honor Max with a Medal of Bravery. Full ceremony, news coverage, the works." Hayes blinked. "Are you serious?" Nick chuckled. "Dead serious. Your partner here is officially a legend." Hayes looked at Max, who tilted his head slightly, as if questioning why everyone was making such a big deal. A small, tired smile tugged at Hayes' lips. "He was already a legend to me." Max let out a soft huff and nudged Hayes' arm gently. It was all the thanks he needed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of attention, media coverage, and public admiration. But for Max, none of it mattered. His focus remained on one thing, staying by Hayes' side. Even as reporters gathered outside the hospital, eager to get a glimpse of the now-famous K9, Max refused to leave the sterile, beeping environment of Hayes' recovery room. Nurses and doctors had stopped trying to make him move. They understood now. He wasn't just a police dog. He was family. Hayes was getting stronger. His color had returned. His voice no longer sounded like gravel scraping against stone, and he could sit up without wincing. But even with all the improvements, Max watched him like a hawk. Every breath, every movement, he was alert, making sure nothing went wrong again. Nick visited every day, bringing updates from the precinct. "The suspect you and Max caught?" he said, sitting beside Hayes with a smirk. "Guy's a repeat offender. Armed robbery, grand theft auto, resisting arrest. Had a history of running. If you and Max hadn't taken him down, he would have disappeared." Hayes ran a tired hand over his face. "And to think all it took was nearly dying." Nick laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Yeah, well, that part wasn't fun." His gaze flickered to Max. "I don't think he's let you out of his sight once." Hayes smirked. "Nope, and I'm not about to make him." Max perked his ears as if he understood. His tail gave a single, slow wag, but his body remained still, watching, waiting. Then came the day Hayes was finally cleared for release. The hospital doors swung open, and the first thing he saw was cameras. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk, microphones flashing, eager faces pressing forward. "Officer Hayes, how are you feeling? What does it mean to you, knowing your K9 saved your life? Max has become a national hero. What do you have to say about that?" Hayes sighed, glancing down at Max, who sat obediently at his side, his eyes sweeping the crowd like he was assessing a potential threat. "I think," Hayes said, keeping his voice even, "that my partner did what he was trained to do. And more than that, what he was born to do." Max's ears flicked. Hayes reached down, giving him a scratch behind them. "This isn't about medals or fame," Hayes continued. "This is about the bond between an officer and his K9. He didn't just take down a suspect. He didn't just help save my life. He never left my side. That's what makes him a hero. The cameras flashed. The reporters kept talking. But none of it mattered. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just another story to sell. This was a partnership, a brotherhood, a bond that couldn't be broken. And as Hayes and Max walked away from the crowd, side by side once again, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would always face it together. The ceremony was set for the following weekend, but for Hayes and Max, it felt like the buildup had been going on for a lifetime. The precinct had fully embraced Max's heroism, and everywhere Hayes went, officers stopped him just to talk about the K9 that had not only taken down a fugitive but had saved his handler's life. Hayes didn't argue with the praise, but in his mind, Max had always been a hero. It didn't take viral videos and a mayor's commendation to prove it. He had known from the moment they were partnered together that Max wasn't just another police dog. He was family. The morning of the ceremony, Hayes woke up earlier than usual. His chest still ached slightly from the incident, but his body had mostly recovered. Max was already up, sitting near the door of his apartment, watching him like he always did. Always ready, always waiting. Hayes exhaled, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Guess we should get moving, huh?" Max thumped his tail against the floor but didn't move until Hayes gave the signal. "Come on, buddy." The precinct had arranged a full honors ceremony. The streets were lined with officers in uniform, standing at attention. People from the community had gathered, and reporters were lined up near the podium. A massive banner stretched across the steps of City Hall, displaying Max's name in bold letters. But Max didn't care about any of it. His sharp brown eyes flicked between Hayes and the unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Always alert, always protecting, Hayes led him toward the front of the stage, where the mayor, the police chief, and a handful of other officials waited. The Medal of Bravery, encased in a small velvet box, rested on a podium. The mayor cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We are gathered here today to honor a very special member of our police force, a partner who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, courage, and a level of heroism that has inspired this entire city." Applause rippled through the crowd. This officer, the mayor continued, did not hesitate in the face of danger. When his partner was in distress, he refused to leave his side. And when a dangerous fugitive tried to escape, he did what needed to be done. Without fear, without hesitation. Max sat perfectly still, his posture straight, his head high. Hayes smirked. Always the professional. The mayor smiled. "Max, on behalf of this city, we honor you with the Medal of Bravery." The applause this time was deafening. Officers clapped, the public cheered, and for the first time, Hayes saw something he hadn't expected. Tears. People in the crowd were crying. It wasn't just about a heroic dog. It wasn't just about stopping a criminal. It was about loyalty, about devotion, about a bond that could not be broken. Hayes knelt beside Max as the chief pinned the medal onto his harness. "You deserve this, buddy." Max turned his head slightly, giving Hayes one long, steady look. Hayes knew what it meant. This wasn't about medals. This wasn't about ceremonies. This was about them, together as it had always been. The ceremony had ended, but the story of Max and Hayes had only grown larger. News stations across the country ran the footage of the event, showing Max sitting proudly as the Medal of Bravery was pinned to his harness. Social media exploded with messages of admiration, photos of the duo going viral. Yet, through all the attention, Hayes knew one thing. To Max, nothing had changed. He was still the same dog, the same partner who woke up every morning ready for the job, ready to protect. Fame, recognition, medals, none of that mattered to Max. What mattered was duty. A few days after the ceremony, the precinct held a small, private gathering just for the officers who had worked with Hayes and Max over the years. It was quieter, more personal. Hayes preferred it that way. Max, as usual, stayed close to his side. But this time, his ears were a little more relaxed, his posture a little less tense. He wasn't working. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was just being. Nick clapped Hayes on the shoulder as he approached, a beer in one hand. "Well, look at you. All recovered and officially partnered with the most famous K9 in the country." Hayes smirked. "He's always been famous to me." Nick chuckled. "Fair point. But still, it's not every day the mayor gives a police dog a medal." Hayes glanced down at Max, who was currently being spoiled by half the department. Officers were crouched down, scratching behind his ears, sneaking him treats, praising him like he was a celebrity. Max tolerated it. Barely. Hayes grinned. "I think he's ready to go back to work." Nick shook his head. "Man, you just got out of the hospital. Take a week. Let the dog rest." Hayes scoffed. "Trust me, Max doesn't rest." As if proving his point, Max suddenly stood, ears flicking forward. His eyes locked onto something outside the window. His posture shifted, not tense, but focused. Hayes followed his gaze. Nothing looked out of place. Just the street, a few cars, people walking by. But Max's instincts were sharp, and when he noticed something, it usually meant something wasn't right. "Hey," Hayes said, nudging his partner gently. "What do you see?" Max stared for a moment longer, then let out a soft huff before turning back to Hayes. Nick raised a brow. "He's still in work mode, huh?" Hayes smirked. "Always." The night continued, laughter filling the room as stories were shared. But Hayes knew that by the next morning, both he and Max would be back in uniform, ready for the next call. Because medals were great, recognition was nice, but at the end of the day, Max was a police dog, and a hero never stops protecting. The morning air was crisp as Hayes stepped out of his apartment, uniform neatly pressed, badge polished. It had been weeks since the incident, since his body had betrayed him, since Max had saved him. Yet, as he adjusted his vest and checked his gear, it felt as if nothing had changed. Because for him and Max, the job was never about a single moment. It was a lifetime commitment. Max sat by the door, watching him closely. His ears flicked forward, his body tense, waiting for the next command. Hayes smiled and gave the signal. "Come on, partner." Max moved without hesitation, walking in perfect sync beside him. The drive to the precinct was routine, but as they pulled into the parking lot, Hayes noticed something strange. Officers stood outside, waiting. The moment his car rolled in, heads turned, conversations stopped. Hayes parked and stepped out cautiously. "What's going on?" Nick smirked, leaning against a squad car. "Nothing. Just figured we'd all be here to welcome back the legends." A wave of applause rippled through the gathered officers. Max, naturally, was unimpressed. He sat beside Hayes, tail flicking once in mild interest before his sharp brown eyes moved across the scene, scanning. Always alert, always working. Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. "You guys are ridiculous." Nick shrugged. "Hey, it's not every day a K9 and his handler take down a fugitive, survive a near-death experience, and become national heroes." Hayes rolled his eyes, but before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Officer Hayes, Officer Mack, the chief." The crowd quieted as the chief stepped forward, his presence commanding as always. His gaze settled on Max, and for the first time since Hayes had known him, there was something almost soft in his expression. "You're back," he said simply. Hayes nodded. "Wouldn't be anywhere else, sir." The chief glanced at Max. "And you? You ready for duty?" Max let out a sharp bark. A chuckle rippled through the gathered officers. Hayes smirked. "I think that's a yes." The chief exhaled, nodding. "Good, because we need you both out there." And just like that, it was back to normal. They were officers again, partners. A few hours later, Hayes and Max were back in their patrol unit, responding to calls like they had 100 times before. There were no news cameras, no reporters, no ceremonies, just the job. And that was exactly how they liked it. As they drove through the city, Hayes glanced at Max, who sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, gaze sharp, always watching. He reached over, giving Max a quick scratch behind the ears. "Let's keep doing what we do best, huh?" Max huffed, his tail wagging once in agreement. The radio crackled. A call was coming in. Hayes straightened, gripping the wheel. Max shifted, his muscles coiling with readiness. The world may have seen them as heroes, but for them this was just another day on duty, and they wouldn't have it any other way. The weeks passed, but the legend of Max never faded. Officers at the precinct still talked about him like he was a living myth. The dog who had chased down a fugitive, saved his handler, and became a national hero. But for Max, none of that mattered. The cameras were gone. The ceremonies were over. The media had moved on, and that meant he could finally get back to doing what he loved. His world was simple: protect, serve, and stand beside his handler. Hayes knew it too. Every morning, when he stepped into his uniform and clipped Max's harness, he felt it, the silent promise between them, a bond that could never be broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, they found themselves on a routine patrol. The streets were calm, the radio quiet for once. Hayes glanced at Max, who sat beside him in the squad car, ears perked. "We're overdue for a slow shift, don't you think?" Max didn't react, just kept watching the world pass by. Hayes chuckled. "Didn't think so." Just as he reached for his coffee, the radio crackled to life. "Units, be advised, we have a possible breaking and entering in progress. Suspect on site." Hayes set his cup down, adrenaline kicking in. He reached over and gave Max a firm pat. "Let's go, partner." The sirens blared as the squad car sped through the streets. The rush of the chase, the electric energy of the unknown. This was what they were made for. Max leaned forward slightly, his muscles tensing with anticipation. As they approached the scene, Hayes flicked the lights off and pulled to a quiet stop near the darkened storefront. The suspect was still inside. Max's ears twitched. His nose flared. He let out a low, controlled growl. Hayes smirked. "You smell him, don't you?" Max's body went rigid, waiting for the command. Hayes unbuckled his seatbelt, his pulse steady. "All right, buddy. Let's go introduce ourselves." The door swung open. Max leapt down, his eyes locked on the entrance. Hayes exhaled, gripping his flashlight. Another night, another call, and just like always, they would face it together. The night air was crisp as Hayes and Max moved toward the storefront, their breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. The suspect was still inside, a lone figure moving between the shelves, unaware that his time was running out. Max's ears perked forward, his entire body locked in focus. He could hear it, the shuffling of feet, the faint rustle of fabric against metal racks. His nose twitched, cataloging the scent. Hayes kept his voice low. "Stay close." Max didn't need to be told twice. They approached the side entrance and Hayes tested the handle. Locked. He keyed his radio. "Unit 17 on scene. Suspect still inside." Preparing to make entry, the dispatcher confirmed. Backup was on the way. But Hayes and Max had never been the type to wait. With a flick of his wrist, Hayes motioned toward the front entrance. Max understood immediately. They moved as one. Hayes pushing open the glass door while Max slipped in low, his paws silent against the tiled floor. The store was dimly lit, casting long shadows against the aisles. Hayes scanned left. Max veered right. The bond between them was unspoken, effortless. A clatter broke the silence. A figure darted between the shelves, knocking over a display in panic. Hayes lifted his flashlight, illuminating a young man. Mid-20s, nervous eyes, hoodie pulled over his head. He clutched a bag, stuffed full of stolen goods. "Police!" Hayes barked. "Drop the bag and show me your hands." The suspect hesitated. Max took a step forward. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Not aggressive, but a warning. The suspect's breathing quickened. He looked at Hayes, then at Max. Then he ran. Bad choice. "Max! Take him!" Max launched forward. The suspect barely made it 2 strides before 100 pounds of trained muscle slammed into his legs. He hit the ground hard, arms flailing, the stolen bag spilling open. Max landed on top of him, his teeth bared but not biting, just holding, controlling. The suspect froze, his breath ragged. Okay, he gasped. I'm done. Hayes moved in, securing the cuffs. Bad night to run, huh? The suspect didn't answer, just glanced nervously at Max, who remained locked in place, his deep brown eyes watching. Hayes patted Max's side. Good boy. The backup units arrived minutes later, and Max finally stepped back, his duty fulfilled. Hayes stood, gripping the suspect's arm. Let me give you some advice, he said. When you see a K9, don't run. The suspect swallowed hard. Yeah, I get that now. Hayes smirked. Good. Lesson learned. Max exhaled, shaking out his coat before trotting back to his handler's side. Just another night, just another call, and they were ready for the next one. The night settled into a familiar rhythm. Paperwork, reports, routine calls. For most officers, it was just another shift. But for Hayes and Max, every night was a mission. After securing the suspect and logging the evidence, they headed back to the precinct. The lights hummed overhead as Hayes dropped into his chair, exhaling deeply. Max, ever watchful, sat by his side, his ears flicking at every distant sound. Nick strolled past, tossing a file onto Hayes' desk. Another one in the books, huh? Hayes smirked. You sound surprised. Nick shrugged. Not surprised, just impressed. Your partner's a machine. Hayes reached down, running a hand over Max's back. Yeah, well, he's the best there is. Max gave a short huff, as if acknowledging the compliment but refusing to let it go to his head. Nick chuckled. Well, if you're done playing hero, you might want to check this out. He tapped the edge of a folder. People have been sending letters, messages. Some of them are for you. Hayes raised a brow. And Nick's grin widened. Most of them are for him. Hayes flipped open the file, and sure enough, dozens of letters and emails were printed out. Messages from strangers, kids, fellow officers, all of them thanking Max. One caught his eye. Dear Max, I hope you know that you're a real hero. I want to be a K9 officer one day, just like your partner. Thank you for being brave. Hayes swallowed hard, blinking at the unexpected emotion creeping up his throat. Nick slapped his shoulder. Told you. You two aren't just cops anymore. You're an inspiration. Hayes scoffed. We're just doing our job. Nick smirked. Try telling that to the kid who just wrote you. Max tilted his head, watching Hayes as if he, too, was waiting for an answer. Hayes exhaled, setting the letter down. Guess we better keep giving them something to look up to. Huh? Max thumped his tail once. Nick grinned. Yeah, guess you better. The radio crackled, breaking the moment. Unit 17, possible disturbance. Downtown sector. Are you available? Hayes reached for his radio. Affirmative. En route. Max was already on his feet, muscles tight, ready to move. Hayes grinned. Come on, partner. Let's go show them what we do best. And with that, they headed out side by side, as they always had been. The drive through the quiet city streets was routine, but for Hayes and Max, every call had the potential to be something more. The radio was quiet after the last dispatch, but Hayes knew better than to assume the night would stay that way. Max sat in the passenger seat, his posture straight, his gaze sweeping the darkened roads. Always watching, always ready. Hayes glanced over, smirking. You ever take a break, buddy? Max didn't react, didn't turn, just stayed locked in focus. Hayes chuckled. Didn't think so. The radio crackled again. Unit 17, checking status on disturbance call. No response from reporting party. Hayes picked up the radio. Copy that. Arriving on scene now, the squad car rolled to a stop outside a dimly lit storefront. A flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a dull red glow across the pavement. The street was empty, but something felt off. Max's ears twitched. Hayes noticed. He always noticed. You hear something? He murmured. Max didn't move for a second. Then suddenly he let out a low growl. Hayes' grip on the wheel tightened. Max didn't growl unless there was a reason. Slowly, Hayes reached for his flashlight, stepping out of the vehicle with Max moving silently beside him. The air was still, but there was an edge to it. Something unseen, something waiting. Then a sound, a scrape, a shuffle. Max stiffened. His tail went rigid, his entire body coiled like a loaded spring. Hayes turned just in time to see a figure darting between the alleyways. "Police!" Hayes barked. "Stop right there!" The figure didn't stop. Max didn't wait for a command. He launched forward, his muscles exploding into motion. The chase was on. Hayes sprinted after them, heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins. Max was gaining ground fast. The suspect turned sharply into an alley, but he was too slow. Max was already on him. A leap, a calculated strike. The suspect hit the ground hard, arms flailing. Max pinned him instantly, his deep growl vibrating through the night air. By the time Hayes caught up, the suspect was already going still, hands raised. "I give up. I give up," the man gasped, terror flashing in his eyes. Hayes exhaled, catching his breath. He reached for his cuffs. "Bad night to run, huh?" Max stepped back only when Hayes gave the command. Even then, his sharp brown eyes never left the suspect. Watching, waiting, ensuring. The suspect, still panting, glanced at the dog warily. "Man, that's not just a dog," Hayes smirked. "No, he's a police officer." With the suspect secured, Hayes patted Max's side. "Nice work, partner." Max let out a quiet huff, as if to say, "Just doing my job." And as they headed back to the squad car, with another criminal in custody and another night's work well done, Hayes knew one thing for sure. No matter what the job threw at them, no matter the danger, no matter the odds, Max would always be there. Because he wasn't just a K9. He was family.